Let's thread the Simplicity 8220 sewing machine. To begin, we remove the compartment to expose the free arm, and next you slide open the bobbin cover and remove the bobbin case. Our goal here is to wind the bobbin. Place your thread spool onto the spool pin and then guide the thread around the bobbin winding tension. I'm going to zoom in here. Now we are going to wind the thread around the bobbin just a couple of times before we place it into the bobbin winder spindle, and push the spindle to the right to engage the bobbin winder. Once the bobbin is full, the machine automatically stops. Now cut the thread close to the bobbin and move the bobbin winder spindle back to its original position. Next, insert the bobbin into the bobbin case. I want you to pay attention to this step. Next, we hold the bobbin case by its latch and insert it into the hook assembly. Now here you can see that it's not snugly fitted, and hence the thread would not be picked up by the needle when we start to sew. So to avoid that from happening, you have to ensure that the finger of the bobbin case fits right into its groove, and this should prevent that issue. Now we are ready to thread the upper thread. Place your thread spool onto the spool pin, then guide the thread through the first thread guide at the top of the machine, just behind the bobbin thread tension. Bring the thread down to the front of the machine and guide it between the tension discs, making sure it sits properly. Continue pulling the thread so it slips under the tension spring and into that thread channel. Next, bring the thread back up and pass it through the take-up lever from right to left. Once it's through the take-up lever, bring the thread back down again. And guide this thread through the lower thread guide. And then you'd see a small coil just after that, right above the needle. Finally, the thread goes into the eye of the needle from front to back. With the upper thread in place, it's time to bring up the bobbin thread. As the needle goes down and comes back up, it will catch the bobbin thread and pull up a loop. You can use a pair of small scissors, tweezers, or even your fingers to pull the bobbin thread completely through. Then you place both the upper and bobbin threads underneath and behind the presser foot. Close the bobbin cover back into place and reattach the accessory compartment we removed earlier to cover the free arm. Before we begin sewing, let's take a look at a few basic controls. This is the presser foot lever, which raises and lowers the presser foot. You will also use the hand wheel to manually raise or lower the needle whenever needed. Before starting a seam, it is good practice to lower the needle into the fabric using the hand wheel. We'll begin with a straight stitch. To secure the end of a seam, use the reverse lever to sew a few stitches backward. That is the reverse lever and it is used for backstitching. It helps lock the stitches in place to prevent the seam from unraveling. As you can see, this machine backstitches neatly along the same line as the forward stitches, giving it a very clean finish. This machine comes with 21 built-in stitches, which are selected using the stitch selection dial. Here are separate controls for stitch length, stitch width, and needle position. Let's see how the stitch length affects your sewing. We've previously sewn on stitch length of 4, now we reduce it to 1 while keeping the other settings the same. Notice how the stitches become much shorter and closer together. With a stitch length of 4, I could fit in my tweezers, but at a stitch length of 1, it's much denser and my tweezers couldn't go in. Now let's take a look at stitch width. We return our stitch length of 1 to 4 and we'll keep the stitch selection dial on stitch 1 and increase the stitch width to 5. If you look closely at the stitch chart, you will notice that stitch 1 includes both a straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. The stitch width determines which one you get. At a stitch width of 5, you'll get the widest zigzag available for this stitch. And here is the finished look. Now let's keep exploring the other built-in stitches. Keeping the stitch width and stitch length the same, we'll change only the stitch selection dial from stitch 1 to 3. And the purpose of this is to make it easier to see the effect of changing one setting at a time, which is the stitch width and stitch length. Here's a close-up of stitch number 3. Notice how it's well rounded. Now let's reduce the stitch length from 4 to 2 while leaving the other settings unchanged. Here you'll notice that reducing the stitch length makes the stitches more compact, giving a result that more closely matches the stitch diagram on the machine. Next, we'll keep the stitch length at 2 and change the stitch width to 2. Here's the result. The stitch is now narrower compared to the first one, with smaller side-to-side movement, giving it a smoother and more compact appearance. Finally, let's increase the stitch length back to 4 while keeping the stitch width the same. Notice how the stitch actually opens up. The curves become longer and more gradual, creating a less dense pattern compared to the previous one. As a general guide, you can leave your stitch width at 5 and only make some changes to your stitch length till you get a result that is closest to what you're looking for. And feel free to experiment and play around with these settings. Let's move on to some of the decorative stitches. We'll select stitch number 10 and sew a sample. You can see how closely the finished stitch matches the illustration printed on the machine. This setting was at a stitch length of 2. I also tested several other decorative stitches, including stitches 11, 17, 19, and they all produce clean and well-defined patterns. One of the best things about this machine is the variety of decorative stitches available and how good they look. Moving on, let's take a look at the stretch stitches. On this machine, the stretch stitches are identified by the red markings on the stitch chart. To sew them correctly, you turn the stitch length dial to F, which is the recommended setting for stretch stitches. I'll be demonstrating stitches 8 and 9 on a single line. And there is a close-up. You can see how well they look. To round off, let's take a quick look at these two final features. This machine is equipped with a built-in sewing light, and to turn it on and off, you simply press the light switch. Lastly, let's take a look at the needle position control. If you don't notice the needle moving when you adjust the needle position, check your stitch weight setting first. If the stitch weight is set to 5, the needle position won't change as expected because the machine is sewing a zigzag stitch. To adjust the needle position, first set the stitch weight back to 0 for a straight stitch. Then you can move the needle to the left, center, or right depending on your sewing needs. That's it for this tutorial. I hope this video has helped you understand how to thread and use this machine properly. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment below, and subscribe for more sewing machine tutorials. Thank you so much for watching.